Hello students, I'm sure you are familiar with Ghana's oft-quoted definition about the state. The state is a body of persons, more or less numerous, permanently occupying a definite portion of territory, independent or nearly so of external control, and possessing an organized government to which the great body of inhabitants render habitual obedience. But you will see that it is the kind of government that prevails at any point of time, or the regime that exists, that actually lends particular character to the state. India, in the initial years after independence, exhibited a high degree of stateness and a distinctly anti-imperialist stance, which get replaced by the time we come to the decade commencing with the 1990s. So we will take a look at the nature of the Indian state as it prevailed at the time of independence and a few decades thereafter. The Indian state at the onset of independence was clearly a strong and an interventionist state. The needs of defense, national integration resulted in this high degree of stateness alongside the urgent need for planned economic development. This measure of high stateness seemed to diminish with the dawning of the age of liberalization and globalization. Such diminution manifested itself during the post-1980 scenario, when, consequent upon enunciation of the new rules of the game in the realm of international trade and commerce by the Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank, the IMF and the WTO, India has also accommodated alterations and has initiated new legislations. Let us have a look at the legacy of state construction in India. From the beginning, the thinking in India has been in terms of conceiving the state as a nation state. On the one hand, this involves the task of building a single new identity called the nation, encompassing several identities and affiliations. On the other hand, this very conception of encompassing diverse entities, social, regional, linguistic, cultural, meant giving a key role to the state through which the composite nation state was to be created. In fact, it was a stateness that gave to the new entity at the same time an encompassing, representative and a transcendental quality. And we will see from the very beginning the centrality of the role of the state. International thinking and general theoretical predispositions too were in favor of the centrality of the role of the state in post-colonial societies. So what was happening in India was also true of other post-colonial societies. The state was at the same time a symbol of authority as well as an instrument of social change. The basic ideology was integrationist, though it also carried within it notions of social change and transformation. And the task of nation building seemed uppermost. For a long time, the nation building exercise was conceived to be one that simultaneously led to greater unity of the nation and greater involvement and participation for the citizen in the institutions of the state. Hence, the conception of an open society emerged, fostering a simultaneous belief that democratic participation was the best way for achieving national integration. And in this role, the political elite has a domineering role to play. The elite undertook to promote democracy through the very composition and the institutional structure of the state. The parliament and the state legislatures, cabinet government at different levels, which were to promote consensus by ensuring representation of diverse regions and interests, and an administrative structure that was going to be accountable. There was also a federal continuum through which such governments and administrations were to operate. And of course, a judicial system was put in place to ensure that all institutions operate responsibly and with due respect to the rule of law. There was also a unique party system which saw to it that the relationship between the government and the social structure was a continuous one, both vertically and laterally. And India designed itself from the very beginning as a federal polity because the various needs were felt at the time of India's independence by different participating units of the Indian Federation. The liberal democratic state was not merely the result of 4 years of deliberation in the Constituent Assembly or the political legacy of 4 decades of gradual parliamentary growth. Models for the founding of states and for political change arise in both domestic and international environments. And one of the important examples that I would like to posit here is the influence of the Government of India Act 1935, which contained 2 very significant provisions. First, the introduction of a federal polity in India, and second, the establishment of provincial autonomy in the British Indian provinces. In place of the old unitary form of government, the new federal form was to bring both British Indian provinces and the Indian state into one organic whole. So India was also, alongside being a federation, India was also designed as a liberal state. When a liberal theory of state became the principal determinant of the 1950 Constitution, it drew on both domestic and international exemplars. It expressed the liberal obligation to recognize civil and political rights along the Westminster model of government. It also included a more traditional Indian understanding that claims to take state sovereignty and monopoly over public and national interests were constrained by the traditional obligation of the ruler to recognize and uphold the jurisdiction of prior social groups. And all this gave way to high stateness in India, which is associated with its imperial legacies and the requirements of an interventionist managerial state pursuing both welfare and socialist objectives. The claim that the state has a special relationship to the public good, that the state's interest is uniquely identified with the public interest, and that the interests of social groups are narrow, partial, and selfish, dates from the early 1970s. India became a republic, casting aside the autocratic monarchical doctrines and administrative state of king, emperor, and viceroy. It was also a democracy where for the first time the political masters, those who would represent and govern, were chosen on the basis of universal suffrage. And India also posited itself as a welfare and a socialist state committed not only to economic growth and self-reliance, but also to social justice and national power. That India is committed to socialism was known from its earliest days. Austin notes that the Constituent Assembly's belief in parliamentary government was strengthened at large by the intellectual or emotional commitment of many of its members to socialism. However, what was important to most members was not that socialism be embodied in the Constitution, but that a democratic constitution with a socialist bias be framed so as to allow the nation in the future to become as socialist as its citizens desired or as its needs demanded. Being in general imbued with the goals, the humanitarian basis, and some of the techniques of social democratic thought, such was the type of the constitution that the Constituent Assembly members created for independent India. And India has also committed itself to welfarism because it was conscious that the Charter on Fundamental Rights, impressive though it is, does not really contain any provision for economic rights, which lacuna was sought to be made up to a large extent by the democratic principles of state policy. Austin notes that it is the directive principles where one finds an even clearer statement of social revolution. They aim at making the Indian masses free in the positive sense, free from the passivity engendered centuries of coercion by society and by nature, free from the abject physical condition that had prevented them from fulfilling their best selves. This is ensured by requiring the state to apply the precepts contained in the directive principles of state policy enumerated in the Constitution, which were an important aspect of the democratic constitution that India gifted to her citizens. And we gradually moved towards a maximalist state. When India chose to follow a socialistic pattern of development and equipped herself with a mixed economy to that end, it was to assume that the state was gradually shifting away from a conventional liberal model towards a maximalist state. For Nehru, socialism meant using the planned development of an industrial society as a panacea for all the social ills. In a mixed economy, the state would occupy the commanding heights. The socialist state would serve society by providing collective and public goods from which everyone would stand to benefit. Equally important, concentrations of private economic power were to be eliminated or controlled so that they could not appropriate state authority or resources or unduly influence the choice and implementation of state policy. But what does it mean to say that the state acts? Chatterjee raises a pertinent question. What does it mean to say that the state acts? Does it act on its own? What the state thinks as politically necessary or feasible is basically given to the planner. It is determined by a process of politics that is extraneous to the planning exercise. The task of the planner is to work out the consistencies between the different objectives, weigh the costs and the benefits of different alternatives, and suggest an efficient or optimal mix of strategies. Despite the fact that India embarked on a socialistic path of development and took recourse to planning as a means to that end, there are many who characterize the Indian state as essentially capitalistic in its tenor. And that is because of the class character of the Indian state. As Byers argues, the Indian urban bourgeoisie is manifestly one of the dominant classes in the Indian social transformation, and the Indian state has consistently attempted to represent the interests of this class via development planning, via the public sector, via a concerted attempt to keep organized labor in check, and in all kinds of other ways. In fact, the post-colonial state in India has been primarily preoccupied with the creation of the conditions for a successful transforming capitalistic development. The instrumentalist view of the state is thereby posited in a narrow functional sense of laying the groundwork for capitalism and ensuring its dominance and development. So what we see in 1947, when India made its tryst with independence, is a clearly centralized state. Paul Brass comments that India's constitution was born more in fear and trepidation than in hope and inspiration. Such fear of disorder was not entirely unfounded, given the multiplicity of explosive forces that had been rocking the subcontinent in the form of Muslim separatism, militant Hindi nationalism, communalism, secessionalism, and revolutionary communism. So too many disruptive forces and disintegrating forces were threatening India since the time of independence. The response of India's constitution makers to these threats and dangers was to frame a constitution with numerous provisions designed to deal effectively with the threat of disorder through the creation of a strong centralized state. Otherwise, perhaps the balkanization of India would have been inevitable. So India in 1947 is clearly a control and a command state. India from the time of independence exhibited the character of a strong state grounded in the convictions of Nehruvian socialism and spearheading the goals of social justice through its model of a mixed economy. Besides, the fact that India was born with hostile neighbors together with divisive explosive forces like communalism that I have just mentioned, they thrust upon the state a degree of control and command that seemed to be clearly the need of the hour. Kohli therefore comments that the state has played the central role in producing this mixed economic outcome, the argument being that the modern interventionist state that replaced the laissez-faire colonial state at mid-century provide a framework for modest economic growth and industrialization, a clear improvement over the nearly stagnant free market colonial economy that preceded it. So colonialism definitely left an indelible imprint on not only the freedom movement of India, but also the kind of state that emerged in the aftermath of independence. Kohli explains the impact of colonialism with reference to a number of factors. First, the state that Indians inherited from the colonial past was modern and democratic, yet not all that effective as an economic actor. This state was a product of both colonial construction and nationalist pressures and design. The British in India created the basic state architecture, political unity and centralized authority, a modern civil service and armed forces and rule of law, an independent judiciary, and rudiments of federalism and democracy, with increasing and growing participation by Indians. The second factor that was impacted by colonialism. India's mass nationalist movement developed in opposition to the colonial state as a vehicle for capturing state power. The political process helped to create a sense of nation in India. Remember, nation building was a top priority in the initial years after independence. And this generated political values that placed a premium simultaneously on democracy and statist development. But while India's nationalist movement was a powerful oppositional force, it never developed a corresponding organizational structure, such as a tightly knit political party or even a coherent political strategy that would allow it to redesign the state in accordance with its development ambitions. The Indian nation, therefore, was definitely a negative response because it was born as some kind of a hatred to foreign rule, because otherwise the diverse elements were far too many within the nation. The whole idea of the Indian nation was, in a way, therefore, a negative response, for it was born out of hatred against a common enemy, and it was this negative factor which consolidated the otherwise fragmented elements of the Indian polity. But after independence, this consensus gradually started waning. The attainment of independence and the concomitant departure of the colonial rulers exposed the fragility and fragmentary character of the multi-class Indian state, which was subsequently unable to enunciate and execute developmental policies and programs based on consensus, which explains the low trajectory of economic progress that followed. As Kohli puts it, the result was a fragmented multi-class sovereign state whose developmental inefficacy has remained at the heart of India's lackluster economic performance. Finally, talking about the impact of colonialism on the nature of the Indian state, the Indian subcontinent was for a long time characterized by low technology, low productivity, agrarian economy. The political instability of the 18th and early 19th centuries resulted in the absence of any spontaneous economic progress. The British in this 19th century setting provided political unity, a national market and infrastructure, but these developments were not sufficient for any kind of sustained economic growth, including industrialization. And that is why what you see inevitably in India in the initial years is some kind of state-guided capitalism. While the role of industry in the overall economy at the time of independence was extremely negligible, still, small India emerged from colonialism with a significant group of indigenous capitalists involved in industry. Remember, it is these capitalists who had also been supportive of Gandhi's movements geared towards India's freedoms, like Swaraj. Equally important, these capitalists and India's national political elite agreed that rapid future industrialization would require protection and active state intervention. Kohli therefore remarks succinctly that whatever socialism has meant in practice, in India it has never really meant anti-capitalism but rather state-guided capitalism, involving planning, public sector emphasis, a state-controlled economy and a few anti-poverty programs like land reform. Its electoral significance was always closely associated with a preference for secular over communal appeals. And that is what explains the genesis of the Licence Raj in India. Barring the first few years after independence, the country was facing a shortage of foreign exchange, and because of this shortage, imports had to be restricted. Imports of consumer goods were therefore disallowed. A good number of restrictions were put on the import of industrial goods, and the efforts of the government was to encourage the production of these goods indigenously. Local industries were encouraged to have foreign collaboration collaborations and to import the technical know-how needed to produce what was being imported into the country. Levying higher tariffs restricted imports, and there was also a total or partial physical ban on the imports of such products. This gave a much needed sheltered market for the Indian goods, and many industries thrived within these protective walls. And that was in fact the basic raison d'etre of the license Raj that prevailed in the initial years after independence. And we see in this system an emphasis on the public sector. Right from the beginning, the planners attached great importance to the public sector. It was expected that the sector would control the commanding heights of the Indian economy. In fact, if you look at the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1948 and 1950, you will find a very important role assigned to the public sector. Power, telephones, communications, atomic energy, defense industries are some areas were reserved for the public sector. Certain industries like life insurance, civil aviation, banks were nationalized and were included in the public sector. Thereafter, whenever there was a shortage, the government of course stepped in to bail out, as it did with the cement and paper industries. So India clearly presents itself in the initial decades after independence as a centralized state. The Planning Commission came into existence in March 1950 as a compromise between those who wanted the commission to enjoy powers of policy implementation and those who wished that it remained basically an advisory body. But it was entirely a top-down approach that the Planning Commission embodied, which you will see getting completely replaced by the Niti Aayog in contemporary times. The extent of control exerted by the state becomes clear from an inspection of some of the industrial policies pronounced by the Government of India in the years following independence. The Industrial Development and Regulation Act of 1951 was a compromise between those who wanted excessive controls and those who wished the self-regulation of industry. A number of sectors were brought under licensing, but development councils were also established to give industry a voice in sectoral policies. The private sector, however, is in a position of dependence with respect to the state. And this is fundamental to the character of the first few decades after India's independence, something which goes a somersault in the time following 1990s. The process of implementation of the Industrial Development and Regulation Act 1951 cognized and confirmed the wide powers that were now available to the government. This resulted in more or less complete control by the bureaucracy on the industrial development of the country, and you will find this getting reiterated by the initial 5-year plans. Private investment in organized industry in the first plan was about twice the level of public investment. Even though private capital had some room for maneuver, the state's powers over private capital through licensing and financial controls rendered the private sector in a position of dependence with respect to the state. So what are the clear instances of state control? In April 1964, the Government of India appointed a Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practice Inquiry Commission to inquire into the existence and effect of concentration of economic power in private hands. The MRTP Act 1969 sought to prevent concentration of economic power to the common detriment, provide for control of monopolistic, restrictive and unfair trade practice, and protect consumer interests. The Act defines monopolistic trade practice as that which represents abuse of market power in the production and marketing of goods and services by eliminating potential competitors from the market and taking advantage of the control over the market by charging unreasonably high prices, preventing or reducing competition, limiting technical development, deteriorating product quality, or by adopting unfair or deceptive trade practices. So we definitely find an intensification of state intervention in the economic activity of the nation. The FERA, or the Foreign Exchange and Regulation Act, was amended in 1973. This brought a greater change in the foreign investment policy of the Government of India. Foreign equity was to be permitted only in companies in Appendix 1 industries or in those that were engaged in exports. Foreign firms were not allowed more than 40% of equity. Only certain industries in the area of sophisticated technology Mukherjee were allowed 51% foreign capital. FERA companies were subjected to many restrictions and were not allowed to participate in certain industries. They were also not allowed to expand and take up production of new products. Mukherjee thus notes that the period between 1969 and 1974 witnessed an intensification of state intervention in economic activity coupled with agrarian reforms. So until the 1980s, from where the change starts happening, we find the prevalence of clearly what has been known as the Licence Raj in India. Such was the regime that earned India the title of the Licence Raj. As Rudolph and Rudolph remark, under state-dominated pluralism, the political arena is populated by relatively autonomous interest groups. But despite their autonomy, they are overshadowed by an omnipresent state. State control of the policy agenda is most clearly expressed in the Planning Commission's perspectives, 5-year and annual plans. Inter alia, targets for most of the investment in the organized economy and for infrastructure, whether it be in the realm of power or irrigation or transport, are basically set by the Planning Commission allocations. The state's monopoly of credit, together with its taxing powers, provides it with extraordinarily powerful means to encourage or deter market and organizational behavior. And that is why, students, the state that emerged in India in the heydays of India's independence and the state that prevailed for the initial couple of decades up to the 1980s, from where the change starts happening and culminates in the 1990s, which inaugurates the liberalization age in India, we find the dominance and the prevalence of a high degree of stateness, a centralized state in India. Thank you.